Hi, and welcome to today's video, in which I'm going to talk about a couple of subjects that are connected to both me as an individual, my bands, and its fan base, which deals with, of course, anxiety, depression, self-destructive behavior or self-harm, isolation, a lot of other things that can be used in a constructive way to learn something about yourself, or in many cases it can be something that harms you and causes a trauma, but that in itself doesn't need to be the end of that, or the thing that defines it, because we all get our traumas over the years and we all find different ways to cope with them and deal with them, finding ways to run or hide from them, or face them and overcome them, or simply accept them. And as always, I'm doing this unscripted, so I just have the questions as a guideline and my own experiences. So I'm just talking out of my own perspective here, and as it is free form, I may brush over some things or forget where I'm going, or even not go as much in depth as some of you may wish that I would. So as always, if you have further questions about something that I'm talking about here, let me know in the comments below. I'm more than happy to follow those subjects up in future videos. And if you're new here, this is not all that I'm talking about, but it all comes in waves, as many things in life, and right now this happens to be a subject that I'm getting a lot of questions about, so I'm simply doing my best to reply and answer the questions and requests that I'm receiving. And if you feel that you are not interested, or if these subjects trigger you, you're more than welcome back another time, but this video will most likely not be for you. But for those of you or us with a more open mind, welcome back. And I'm going to start this with a few of the things that are more in the end of some of the questions, because this is easier subjects to start with, to get into it, and also not completely go off-road or into tangents and avoid too much rambling, because I'm already way in there. So as an example, what I've heard from many over the years that I could never relate to is the idea of listening to sad music would make you feel sad. And I've gotten that as a remark about my music, that some people say they, can't stand my music because it makes them feel sad. But I don't think that sad is the right word in this context, because in many cases these are individuals who are not used to being exposed to melancholy or even sadness or emptiness or other things that are connected to it in music or art. They are not used to those emotions or the other side of them to be broadcast and manifested, because a lot is about projecting positivity and happiness and joy and things like that. There's nothing wrong with that, though in my experience I don't feel anything from those artists. It doesn't interest me. I don't get a impression from it, and to me those kinds of songs are very predictable, and that can be fun sometimes, to be able to predict every single movement or progression in a song. But to me that gets tiring after all, because it doesn't feel like I'm experiencing it. I'm just analyzing it, and it's hard for me to turn that off. So back to what I was starting with here before the semi-ramble, is that those who find that darkness is a projection of themselves onto my music, or even black metal or post-rock or any other genre of music that may have those kinds of atmospheres. And when you're experiencing something that you're not used to or familiar with, it's very natural, I think, to just try to find whatever definition is as close as possible to what you know yourself. And sadness or emptiness is it can be deep, of course, but in many cases it's a shallow experience that is easy to access. So that's why a lot of people have a hard time overcoming it or diving beyond it, because it's something that we are taught in schools and society to avoid, and it's connected to bad things like death and being alone and many other things that connects to traumas and situations that you are cast or put into involuntarily, which of course by itself can be another trauma, because having a lack or a loss of control is in many cases unpleasant experience, and it can take a lot of time and energy and persistence to overcome that fear that in many cases are connected to that loss of control. And I understand that that's not for everyone, so it's natural for them to shy away from it and shield themselves. And that doesn't mean that what you are shielding yourself from or distancing yourself from is a bad thing. It's not just for you. And that's fine. That's why there is so much music, so many artists, so much art. Because there is literally something out there for everyone. And that's also why I don't hesitate to say that for a big majority of black metal or other subcategories of metal, and even black metal itself, like covered in previous videos, I don't have any urges or interest in experiencing or exploring it. I don't have the time, I don't have the energy, and that's not out of ego or a lack of interest or passion, but the opposite. It just happens to be that what I do requires so much from me that I know from over years of experience that I have my limits, and I know what happens when I try to exceed them, and I don't like to overpromise and underdeliver, but I do this mistake annually at least, as some of you have known or experienced both in the past months or past years. And I'm working on it, but just like everyone else, I have my own flaws that I'm working on. And connecting more to one of the other topics and subcategories here, as an individual who doesn't find pleasure in self-harm, but don't shy away from explaining my personal story of it and my perceived benefits of this behavior, while advising others to not replicate what I do. That is my perspective, and I share it because I think it's valuable and important that people know that it doesn't have to be a result of weakness. It's not necessarily a cry for help or attention. It doesn't have to be about that. That's a very old-fashioned and ignorant way to perceive these kinds of things. And I've been in countless arguments about this matter. And of course, many people have their own experience when it comes to self-harm, that they find relief in it. And of course there is the chemical aspect of it, that it releases different inner chemical reactions and hormones in us that have their own interactions, and as we are all different with our own systems and as a part of an ecosystem, or whatever you wish to call it, we all have our own experience of different emotions and atmospheres and sensations, just like music. The self-harming can be connected to so many other things than just the mere shallow surface of it, the physical aspect of it, because just like a needle going through the skin repeatedly to make a mark and make a tattoo, which in itself hasn't always been socially acceptable and still isn't in many cases and places. Having wounds has a completely different and a deeper stigma connected to it. But it's important to remember that there is a deep value embedded into opposites, and like I expressed in the previous video, the act of defiance, knowing that you're walking your own path, that you're doing something on your own terms, that has a deep value of self-expression and self-empowerment. I think we can connect a lot of things to this, that the relief someone feels may not just be on a mental or a psychological level or physical level, and one isn't mutually exclusive to another. That engaging in these rituals, which doesn't need to be cutting, it can be things like eating disorders, which in turn can be connected to diet and exercise and many things, that it can be very beneficial for you if you do it right, but you can easily turn it into a destructive thing. It's all about how you use the tool. And just because a tool can be dangerous doesn't mean that it's not a valuable tool. You just need to learn how to use it. So I think when someone says that they feel relief or pleasure from something, it may not just be the broad definition of those words and terms, but if we dare to not just question it, but debate it and discuss it, we can get into some interesting subjects and get to learn very useful things about ourselves. And then of course there is the aspect of freedom that you can connect to the sense of relief. It may be freedom or distancing yourself from another difficult feeling that you are having in the moment, and it's a break from whatever else that you're doing in that moment, and that can of course have some value in itself. And self-harm can in many ways be meditative, because it's both very ceremonial and ritualistic, and that's why I in many ways connect it to other repetitive rituals that I've over the years replaced cutting with, because they most of all don't require a cleanup, but then you also don't have to deal with other superficial aspects of it, while still retaining the inner benefits from it. As an example, walking. I know it sounds simplistic, but it's not. Walking is a very important ritual. If you do it with intent, as a meditation, and if you find a place where you can be in isolation and immerse yourself into either your own thoughts or nature or a combination of it, to find ways to reach states of mind and conclusions that you may not have access to by yourself in your home or workplace, for example. And that connects to the urges connected to self-harm, which honestly I may not look like it, because I'm rarely covered in wounds, especially not new ones. But I do think about it on a daily basis. Especially when I'm in situations when I know that it would be a limitation to my ability to do something else. In many cases, work, or mostly work actually. And in my case, that just makes me think about it even more, because then you become even more aware of the times in your day or in your weeks or months when you have enough free time that you know, for example, how long time different wounds need to heal. So the urge becomes even stronger when you're getting closer to that moment, because you know that this is the time when you can do it. So I really do what I can to create valid excuses to do something else instead, that has a higher importance and benefit to myself as a person, but also to my career, or which means that it will benefit either of my music or art projects instead. Which some years can be a challenge, because as some of you know, the act of self-harm has been a part of the rituals and ceremonies that are connected to my paintings or my musical recordings. So that's an aspect of the ritual that I, over time, started replacing with meditation and breathing exercises instead. Because that kind of immersion and introversion gets me to a similar place, but it requires practice. And we all have our own reasons and strategies how we cope with these urges. And I'm just being honest with mine. So some of you may require therapy because it's not always fair to expect your friends or family to be the one in charge of taking the responsibility when you are not able to do it yourself. And you may also feel that you don't want to disturb those people with your problems or issues or urges. And I tend to have that mood as well. So I've always had a big complex about disturbing others. In as many cases or instances as possible, no matter how much more time or energy it takes, I prefer to do things on my own terms, in my own way, on my own, than asking someone for help, if I can. And it's very hard for me to ask someone for help. And that's not that I don't trust others. I just have the statistics on my side in many cases that when I've asked or expected someone to help, they haven't been able to. And when that happens enough times, it becomes a second nature to just not expect it at all from anyone. So I don't. And I'm aware that it can sound egoistic to expect someone to reach out to me and prove to me that they can be trusted, because that will in turn take its toll and time on them, which in turn I don't expect. It may feel or seem unfair to be expected to pass these unwritten, unexplained tests. But that's how I feel about all interactions. And I feel that that's the way I am perceived in the world. That I am put to these tests. So isn't it right that others are too? I've never gotten a good answer about that, and I'm not searching for one either. This is just a monologue. And I think this is not a very clear connection, but it definitely is connected, like many things are. Some connections are a bit more hidden or vague than others, that's all. And I think this comes to the subject of why someone would replicate what others are doing, and how I reflect on the probability that someone would start doing something that I do to identify with me or to reach results or conclusions that I have reached, and why someone would emulate me or other artists, either to get a similar result or be perceived as cool or smart or devoted. Anything else you can connect to being an individual or artist. And it's a bit hard to not be vague or distant about this, because obviously everyone is different. Everyone has their own reasons, in turn connected to their own background, on why they do different things and why they expect different things, and why they would behave in certain ways, in turn connected to expectations on what they can have as a result from that behavior. And that's why I'm trying to, for example, show my different interpretations and alternatives to what can be a ritual. Because there are so many ways to describe a ritual, but one way to define it is that it's one or several actions made in a repetitive fashion, that you can immerse yourself into, and that will in turn lead to a state of immersion, meditation, reflection. It's a connection to emptiness and the void, which in turn connects to a vast amount of things with their own paths and benefits. And I will try to have that a bit more evolved in another video that have some other questions that are more connected to rituals and ceremonies. And I think that the idea or urge or need that some have to connect with others and replicate others is connected to so many other things. So it's not just about what you do with your body and what music or art and connected subgenres that you associate with and feel a connection to. And that's something that we have talked about previously when it comes to things like depression and anxiety as well. Because there's always a middle of the road, and what would be perceived as normal or right, correct, whatever you wish to call it. I personally despise all of those words and definitions connected to them. Because there's nothing absolute. That's a very shallow way to simplify things. In other words, it's lazy. And if you wish to be lazy, then you should get accustomed to expecting results that are connected to laziness. In other words, a shallow experience. You can't be lazy and devoted at the same time. Everything needs time and effort to evolve into something else. Nothing just happens on its own. Or at least very few things do. I can't speak for any of you. But as an example, when I was younger, I made it a point in many cases to do things on my own terms instead of doing what others did. For example, if others were smoking at school behind different places in breaks, I would say no. But when it came to the time when I felt like I would be interested in experiencing what that would be like, I went to the outskirts of town on my own volition to a place that I knew was run by people that cared a bit less about the different ideals created by institutions. In other words, if you wanted something that you were too young to get, that was one place to receive it. And that's why I don't like the idea of people asking others about shallow things that they can achieve for themselves. If you want to smoke or drink, if you're underage and you really want to try it, and if you rely on someone else to get there, you don't really want it. That's why there are different rules in place. Because if everything was easy, and if there wasn't any challenges anywhere, life and the people living it would be pretty bored and uninteresting. It's the challenges and overcoming the challenges that makes us into something else. That connects to that in the town where I grew up, I became infamous for having crazy big parties. And I'm not really a social person, believe it or not. But for being bullied and feeling as an outcast for many years, to me it was like a social experiment. Because I, of course, discovered pretty fast that if I created a place where people felt safe and comfortable to be different and do things that they couldn't do in other places, those people would surround me and come to me. So from being an outcast with maybe a social group of 5 to 7 people at most, I used to have between 30 to 50 to 60 people in my circulation instead. And of course, when I made the decision to move away from that city to another, I can count on one hand how many of those still kept in touch. Because of course they didn't care about me or even what I could offer, but just having a connection to that atmosphere, to that mood, to be a part of something. And there is both beauty and ugliness in that, because it shows how shallow some people are, but it also shows the beauty of friendship and how deep the wish is for some people to have a connection to other people. And I think that's the underlying thing in all of this, is the feeling of not fitting in and the feeling of wanting to fit in or finding a place where you fit in. That can be so many things in life. And of course, if you're alone, that's a hard experience in many different ways. But I think it should be pretty understandable when someone is maybe struggling to fit in somewhere, and you find a community of people or artists that behave in a certain way. It's not that strange that you replicate what they do to fit into a community. In many cases that becomes clear at concerts. It's not too far removed from a party. It's just a different venue. And you, of course, see that in bars, sport events or demonstrations or anything else, that it's connected to a community and a philosophy or a ideology. And that's of course why art and black metal is so important and powerful that it has many layers and a lot of depth. And that's of course also like many things, but in this case it's what makes it complicated too. And that's also why I have words like consider in one of my projects, because I don't like to tell people what they should do, but I like to make suggestions, because you should think about things, you should consider things that are beyond your comfort zone, and what is beyond what is possible or realistic in your current self, in your current situation. And that doesn't mean that you should chase after each vision or dream that you have, but you should still encourage those visions, because having ideals, thoughts and dreams, they can all be connected into something very deeply spiritual and positive for what you use to build your reality and whatever creates structure in your life. And if you wish to make that into something creative or not, that's of course up to you. So that is connected to what I'm ending this video with, which is the last question in a series of questions from the same person. And this is something that could be a video by itself and a lot longer than what I'm going to cover here right now. But I don't want this to be 2 hours, and there are things about this that is better to talk about with other people that I know that have other connections in the community and in the black metal scene or metal scene itself. So I will save that for that other time. And of course, as always, questions or requests about anything in depth about something that I'm talking about here is more than welcome. So when it comes to afterthoughts connected to anything that I've released in the past, connected to like aesthetics or related propaganda that can be connected to self-harm or suicide or anything else that you may find connected to black metal or any of those self-defined sub-genres or categories that I don't wish to be affiliated with. I don't have regrets, because you shouldn't do things that you regret. But I always have afterthoughts, and I always consider things both before and after I do something. And there are things, of course, that I can do better. And I'm aware that there are things that could be improved, and would have been better if I stood my ground and was more clear about my vision and persisted to have my vision enforced and manifested properly. But sometimes when I'm in bands or projects with other people, and when I'm in places or times in my life when I don't have the energy to fight or debate things, or when I simply don't have a idea or concept myself for a particular thing, then of course I'm also limited to how much control or power that I have in a situation and a negotiation, for example a release of a certain record. And that comes with limitations, like all things in life. And when it comes to an example like Life Lover, we never had any request for a special edition of anything, but the record label wants special editions because it helps to promote a new release in a band, and in many cases it makes the album or the first press of it more special according to them. But if every release has a special edition, and that special edition is just made for the sake of it, how is that special? And that was our argument about it. That we didn't want to do something just for the sake of it, but they insisted. So we let them run with it. And they just did whatever they wanted and asked us, is this fine? And we said, sure. And then I made some ideas about adaptations to make it more interesting. And they followed some of those suggestions while they forgot some others that would have made it a better release. But at least it made it at least somewhat fine. Which in this case is the embossing of the Life Lover logo on the box set. Instead of just having a metal box, I made sure that there was an embossed logo on it. So it's not just a metal box with different tools for abuse or destruction in them, because that's silly. And for that album I hired photography equipment, and on my own behalf paid for one of my friends who is an educated photographer to join me to do the photo shoot that was the cover art. And we made a very expensive photo session for it, which would have been a perfect photo book. And I still have all of those pictures. And it would also, of course, have made a good picture disc edition of the vinyl, instead of just making it a black and colored vinyl edition. But they didn't want to make a photo or art book for this release, because back then few other bands had done it, but it just happened to be a new format, and several other artists have done it, but in my perspective quite poorly. It was very uninspired, mediocre releases. But just because those bands had a bigger name, they got to have it, while we got a box instead. Because that is making something special just for the sake of special, instead of making something with intent and thought behind it instead. And now the irony is that every release almost that I've seen the past years have an art book. So yeah, that's really special, right? Really, really special. That's how much that word and that term means to some people. But that's also a subject by itself. Because it's probably a bit clear by now that I have an issue with authority and institutions. And that's why I have a difficulty working with different people and companies. That's why some of my work isn't out in this world. It may be someday, but I've done enough compromises over the years, and I won't have it. I'd rather have something take a couple of years extra to be manifested in as close as possible shape and form of my vision than just throw it out. Because there are so many bands and artists out there that do things just for the sake of it, in my perspective. And I refuse to be a part of that. I've done that mistake with very few releases and songs in the past. And I may do it someday again. But if I don't strive and do what I can to progress and improve, I wouldn't have any right to expect and demand the same from others. So that's where I'm ending this video. Thanks a lot for watching and listening, to those of you who have the time and patience. I look forward to see you next time. There's a lot more to come. And there are a lot more to come that I can't say for the moment, but as always, there is something in progress. Thank you for watching. Take care.